What is going on, guys? We are back playing some more Surviving with Mekanism version 10, and today we're going to be going over the Thermoelectric boiler, which is a multi-block that allows us to produce steam by using water and a heat source. Now that heat source can actually be a couple different things. Some of them are a little bit less common, but the first two, which are the less common ones, are both the fuel wood heater and the resistive heater, which are very simple blocks to work with that allow you to generate heat and put it into a machine through either using power or using blocks that can be burned. But that's not actually what we're going to be going over using it with today. Those are very simple to use it with, but the more complicated thing and the more common thing that it is used with is superheated sodium, and that's produced by a sodium-cooled fission reactor, which is what we set up last episode. Now, the reason that this is super common, and probably 99% of the time is going to be the situation people run into, is because every sodium-cooled fission reactor requires a thermoelectric boiler as the middleman between itself and the industrial turbine to actually function. So if you have a sodium-cooled fission reactor, you are going to need a thermoelectric boiler coming right after it if you want to generate any power and get back any of your sodium into your reactor itself. So suffice to say, it is very important that you set this up if you have one of those reactors. And on top of that, there is a ton of stuff to cover with this. And when I say a ton, I mean probably more than anything else we've set up in this entire series, which is honestly surprising, but there are multiple different types of layers that each require different blocks and have different mathematical calculations to determine different internal tank volumes, boil rates, all those different things. And then on top of that, there's also a couple, I'll say, annoying nuances that come along with setting up these large sort of chain closed systems. In this case, it's going to be a reactor, a boiler, and a turbine, with how some of the internal storage works that makes it very necessary to have certain precautions in place so that nothing goes wrong. Even if all the math works out, there are things that you need to take into account that could affect it because of how the calculations are done. So we're going to be going over all of that today. Please do not let all the math and stuff scare you away. I will do my best to explain it very simply to you guys, but I do want to warn you ahead of time that there will be some numbers. So maybe bust out a notepad or something, get a calculator ready, because we are jumping into it. But first things first, we do have to do the crafting, and maybe the nice thematic crafting stuff going on over here with the chests and whatnot will convince some of you to stick around. But for those of you that do not want to stick around and watch the crafting and want to get right into the thick of it with the math and the fun stuff, unless you love math, in which case that's the same thing, you can feel free to skip to the next section of the video or find the timestamp in the description to where we actually start setting this up. And no hard feelings, I understand if you want to skip the crafting. But for those of you that are sticking around, let's jump into it. So, thankfully today, even though there are a lot of different layers to set up for this, and it sounds really complicated with probably how I just said everything, it's actually not that bad with the crafting because it's not going to be a totally huge multi-block. A lot of it is going to be empty, and there's not a ton of different kinds of blocks. But like usual, we've got the boiler casing. We've got the structural glass, which we're getting all too fond of working with. We've got the pressure disperser, which we've seen before. We've got the new block, which is the superheating element. And then we've got a valve for the boiler, much like everything else. So we are going to be making a 7x7x6, and that of course is what's going to determine the quantity of each block that we make. So you're going to have varying quantities of all of these, but chances are you're probably going to want to wait until the next section of the video for me to explain what each one does before we go over why we have how many of each one we have. So I'm just going to say that we are going to be crafting what I believe is 124 of the boiler casing, but we only need 122. And then we're going to be making 4 boiler valves. And so we actually only needed, I believe, 114 of this, but we had to add on the addition for making the boiler valves, which adds 8 more on. And then that came out to not an actual whole number. And so we had to round up to 31 actually, stacks of crafting materials to put in. So that's why we have a couple extra. But next, we're going to be making 4 superheating elements. We're going to be making 80 structural glass, and then we are going to be making 25 pressure dispersers. So a lot of those bad boys compared to everything else, honestly, and you'll understand later. But then we are also going to want to make sure that I don't really need to craft these right now because we have extras, but that we have a couple extra pumps laying around, and that we have a bunch of pressurized tubes, universal cables, mechanical pipes, and ideally they will all be the ultimate version because we are going to be transferring some serious power and gases and fluids here. So let us now head downstairs and start doing some work on this because, like I said earlier, there is a ton to go over. So you can see down here that we have the reactor we set up last episode, and we have the electrolytic separator right here running, and we have I think that's about 4 million extra millibuckets of sodium. Not even close to filling up a single one of these pressurized tubes, but this is important to note. When you start setting this up, you are going to want to make sure, if you plan on doing a very high burn rate in your reactor, that you are getting some extra sodium over here. And we're going to cover why later, but it has to do with how when you are running some of these, the internal storage of these actually fills up, even if theoretically the math should make it that you are instantaneously able to process everything. We might have seen it if you watched the episode where we set up the fission reactor upstairs, where even though all the numbers make it so that we should have it completely full of water and everything is instantly processed by the turbine, condensed and put back in, you still actually have a dip in the actual amount of water inside the reactor, and there will always be steam in the turbine. So that's why, so just a heads up, you want to make sure you have this producing it. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting around for a long time, even if this thing's fully upgraded. So over here, we are going to be setting up right in between these two because it is the middleman, the actual boiler itself. And so this is going to follow the same rules as pretty much every other multi-block we've gone over. So the basics, if you don't know, the minimum size for this, because of all the different layers we set up, is going to be a 3x3x4. The maximum is 18x18x18. And you are going to be able to make the faces of it out of the structural glass, out of the casing, out of the valves, any of those things. But all the edges need to be made out of the actual boiler casing. So we're going to make our quick outline here. And I believe we can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And nice. It's actually right in between these, which is great because no one's OCD is going to be going all over the place. And then we'll come out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which again matches this. So I did actually think ahead of time as to how we're setting this up. And we are actually going to be making the base of this also out of the casing. I have nothing against doing that in this case. The casing itself really doesn't cost much compared to the structural glass, unlike with the supercritical phase shifter, where you wanted as much glass as you could get. Now we're going to be building up on the edges, and then right at the top, we're going to be building across, and we're going to have to get rid of some of these torches. So it might get a little bit dark in here. I'll try and replace them so we got a little bit of light, and then we got to grab out some more of our boiler casing, and we can just fill in the top right here. Again, it can be made out of the glass if you would prefer. Pretty much all the faces can be made out of the glass, but you need to make sure that all the edges are made out of the casing itself. So you can't escape some of it and make it look super cool and just completely see-through, which is unfortunate, but understandable. So there we go. We have the perfect outline of our setup right here, and that's the easy part. Now we are going to get into the actual layers of this because there are 4 different types of layers, some mandatory, some not mandatory. Now, the first type of layer is going to be the heater layer, and this is going to go at the base of your setup. And this is going to be made up of superheating elements and then open space. You don't need open space, but essentially what this is going to do is the superheating elements are going to determine the max boil rate of your thermoelectric boiler. And each one of these adds in 320,000 millibuckets per tick of boil rate. Now, thankfully, because that sounds like a low number compared to the heating rate we have over here, which is going to be at 54 millibuckets per tick burn rate of fissile fuel, 10.8 million millibuckets per tick. But because that is the sodium heating rate, we actually get away with dividing it by 10 because we are going to be looking at the boil rate of the water itself. And so thankfully, the boil rate is going to be, in this case, the heating rate over here was 20,000 from millibuckets of water per millibucket per tick of fissile fuel. Thankfully, we get that same luxury when it comes to boiling, where you can consider it divided by 10. So in this case, we can consider it 1.08 million millibuckets per tick. So take whatever your heating rate is over here, the sodium, divide it by 10, and then divide that number by 320,000 millibuckets per tick. In this case, it comes out to, I believe, 3.375, which you then have to round up because you cannot have a fraction of a superheating element, so we are left with 4. So our heating layer is going to have 4 of these, and we can put them down wherever we want as long as they are connected. And unfortunately, I don't really think there's a great place for us to put them down because right here in the middle of this layer, we are going to have a 5x5. And so since we're stuck with 4 and they have to be connected, it's going to look a little weird, but I think we're just going to put them down right over here like this. And you can see that they all connect. This is similar to, in the industrial turbine, the electromagnetic coils where you can put them down wherever you want, but they do need to be connected and the textures connect. That's how you know you're all set. And that's actually the heater layer. Now you could fill up this entire layer with these if you needed it. Obviously, if your boiler was smaller, you might need to have multiple layers, and that's actually fine. You can have multiple heater layers. You're really only limited by this fact that the max height is 18, and you will need a couple other layers. So you could have a ton of these layers in there if you need it and you want a really skinny one. But you need to remember that these layers all need to be touching each other, and that's pretty much it. Then you're good to go. So here, we only need to have a fraction of one layer, which is fine. We're going to leave the rest air, and then all we're going to do is come around the outside and fill it in with the structural glass. So there we go. And once we fill this portion up right over here, this layer is done. Now, like I said, you can have more heating layers than this if you need it, but the next layer we're moving on to is going to be the water cavity layer. And what this is essentially a layer that allows you to store additional water, because the internal volume of water that can be held by this, much like you look at the internal volume over here, the coolant tank, you got a certain volume, fuel tank, certain volume. The internal tank water volume for this will be determined by the addition of water cavity layers, and also the fact of how many open air spaces you have on your heater layer. So right here, we actually will have the ability to store some water in here, but we're going to make sure that we have enough space. So we are going to add in a water cavity layer. And the great part is it's super cheap because that just means you leave open space. So you want to see how we make a water cavity layer right here? Boom. We just put structural glass around the sides and we have our water cavity layer. We are now done. So there we go. Now you can have multiple of these if you want to have a bigger internal buffer of water. And that's actually something that you're going to want to factor in later when we go over what I mentioned earlier, which is the mathematical calculation issue with how these things store some things internally. So having it, a bigger internal buffer can definitely be nice. It can be avoided if you don't want it, but the smaller the internal buffer, the more issues you're going to run into. So it'll take some trial and error probably because I can't give you guys an exact number, but chances are you want to make sure you have an adequate internal buffer. So just give it some room, give it some additional layers of air for the water cavity layers, and then later I'll be going over the math that's used to actually determine the exact number of the volume of the internal tank based off of this. So the next layer is going to, and we'll actually, we'll add on 2 of these layers just to be safe, because why not? We can. These again have to be directly on top of one another. So any water cavity layer you have is going to have to be on top of the other water cavity layers. You can't have a heater layer, water cavity layer, heater layer. That doesn't work. Now, the next layer, and this one is super critical, is the steam catch layer. This is essentially where your steam is basically going to be made, if you want to think about it like that, and your coolant is going to be returned to you. And this is where these pressure dispersers come in. There's nothing about this layer that actually involves any math. All you need to do is make sure the entire layer is full of pressure dispersers. And you can only have one of these layers in the entire thing. So at the end of your water cavity layers, you are going to basically just fill in the outside like so, and then put down pressure dispersers. And I should probably pull out the glass so I can finish filling this in on the sides here and fill in the remainder of the pressure dispersers like so. You can only have one of these layers, thankfully, because it means that you got to have a lot of pressure dispersers. This is the one layer that you need to fill in completely no matter what. And like I said, there are no mathematical calculations. All this is going to do is allow you to generate steam, and it's required for the boiler to actually form. It's not going to affect the rate at which you produce anything or anything like that. Now, there is one more layer that you can make if you want. We're not actually going to do it today, but it is called the steam catch layer, very similar to the water catch layer, or the steam cavity layer. Sorry, this is the steam catch layer. It's the steam cavity layer, which goes above the steam catch layer, and you can have multiple of them, and those are going to allow you to store more steam internally inside the boiler itself. Now, that's not super critical for us because we are immediately pulling all of it out, and much like the heater layer allows you to store some water there, the steam catch layer allows you to store some steam there. So there will actually be some internal room for the steam based off of this. But if you really want more and you feel the need to have some internal storage, then you make it exactly like the water cavity layer, which is simply leaving airspace above the steam catch layer and just putting down the glass or casing around the outside, and you're done. And again, you can have as many of those as you want. They just need to be on top of each other. So really all we should need to do now is fill in this glass, and boom, we have our thermoelectric boiler. And there's a lot of stuff going on in here. We have our heated coolant tank, our water tank, our boil rate, our max boil rate, our steam tank, and our coolant tank. So right here you got the inputs, right here you got the outputs. We have our temperature here, our boil rate, and our max boil rate. And then in our boiler statistics, we can actually see our maximum water that can be stored in the system, our maximum steam that can be stored in the system, our current superheaters, and the boil capacity, which is directly related to the amount of superheaters. As you can see, it's 4 times 320,000 millibuckets per tick. Now, the critical part is to verify really quickly that you have the boiling capacity times 10 is going to be higher or equal to whatever the max heating rate is for your fission reactor at whatever burn rate you are trying to support. Now, you also want to make sure, and I'll talk about this right now, that when you have the boil capacity to look at, you have the exact number, that you go over to whatever industrial turbine you plan on pumping that steam into. And while I'm not going to go over things about the industrial turbines today because we already have an episode on that, we want to make sure, similar to what we did with the regular fission reactor that has water in it and makes steam, the max flow rate and the water output, whichever one of those is lower, the limiting factor to that, is higher or equal to the max boil rate, the boil capacity, because you want to make sure that this is able to work through all of the steam you're producing in this and pump that water right back over. So that is how you want to look at it. You want to determine the superheaters based off of the burn rate of this that's going to be working. And then you want to take these and make sure that you make a turbine that is able to support the boil rate of the superheaters. So once you have all that, technically, mathematically, you're all set to go. Unfortunately, there are a couple things, again, that are nuances with how the internal buffers kind of work for these that screw that up a bit. But the one thing we can quickly go over, and this may or may not matter to you, but it's going to be how you could actually determine the exact volume of these, the max water and max steam, for your system without actually having to set it up and look at this, because they are determined by mathematical calculations. So the water tank internal is going to be the volume from the base to the top water cavity layer, and then you are going to take that, subtract the number of superheaters, so you're going to take 4 away from that, so whatever the volume is, subtract 4, and then multiply it by 16,000 millibuckets. And that is going to be the volume of your water tank. The steam tank is the same exact thing. You go from the steam catch layer and you go up, so any steam cavity layers, and then you are going to multiply it by 160,000. So that explains right now why, even though we have water catch layers, our max steam is way higher than our max water, because it's simply the volume times something that is a factor of 10 higher than it. So that's why I said you really don't need to worry about steam cavity layers at all. Trying to say these names of all of these when they are so similar is totally screwing me up. So I apologize that I'm, getting a little tongue twisted on these, but doing my best. So hopefully you guys understand. Now the coolant tank is simply the steam tank volume times 1.6, and the heated coolant tank is the water tank times 16. So those are really simple to work with. You're just going to take these values and multiply them by 1.6 and 16 respectively, and then you have your other volumes. So suffice to say that the heated coolant tank is going to be massive, and the coolant tank is going to be also pretty darn big. So now we have everything set up. We've gone over all the math. And theoretically, we should just be able to plug these bad boys in and get going. We got to throw down the valves, and we're all set. Now, there are a couple different things to need to know about setting down the valves. The boiler valves for the input are going to be on the heater and water cavity layers. So I'm going to put them down right here. You can put them in just both on the heater layer, or you can, put them higher up, but I'm just going to put them right here because they'll match the level of those. And we're going to set these both as input. So that's fine, right? They're both set as input. It doesn't matter. You don't need to distinguish between the heated coolant and the water. It'll know which one is which. And then we are going to have to put in the outputs, which there are two, the one for the regular coolant and the one for the steam. So the steam one, we're going to want to put over here, and we are going to we should actually probably move the water input to the other side of this now that I think about it, because the water is going to be coming from over here. So we can put the water in right like this right here. But for the outputs, they're both going to be on the steam catch layer. So if we want to think about where we have the steam coming out, it's going to be going over here. So I'm actually going to put it over here. And that may seem counterintuitive, but I want to make sure that we have enough piping to make sure that the transfer rate matches the super high boil rate of this. Because if you guys don't know, when you have these different pipes and stuff, you want to make sure that they are able to actually transfer enough. And when you put pipes together, the current rate of one pipe is for a single pipe. When you put another one on, it actually increases the rate all the pipes transfer stuff. So a longer pipe system can actually transfer more than a shorter one. So kind of an interesting little tidbit there. But this is going to be the output for the steam. And then we are going to have over here, we're going to want the output for the coolant. And we'll put this right up here because that's also going to be on the steam catch layer. And we can adjust it with a configurator. We shift right click and the output for the coolant. So now we have all the inputs and outputs ready, and we should plug these in. So we want to take the superheated sodium, which is going to come right here, and we want to plug that bad boy in right here. And so that is going to be the pressurized tubes. And so we're going to hook this up and come right across here, and we will know very easily if this is not going to be able to support the rate that we want. So just something to keep in mind. Now this is a coolant output, so this one is going to be hooked up to this right over here. And so we can run this up and across the ceiling right here. And this is what has all of our extra sodium in it, which is really important, like I said, that we make sure we have that extra sodium production going on. So there we go. We now have this hooked up. So the sodium that's been cooled down will be coming back in here, which is exactly what we want. Now we want the water input over here, and the water input comes, if you have never seen industrial turbine video, you should go watch that, but it comes from the vents up here. So we're going to grab out our mechanical pipe, and we are going to put the water in right over here and collect it from, we can get it from any of these sides, so we should just be able to get it from right here. And we're going to have to actually get in there, which is where I want my creative flying. I know I could have a jetpack, guys, but I'm protesting jetpacks until I have my creative flying, which means I need some antimatter, which is why we're doing all this. So a little convoluted, but whatever, we're messed up. It works. So here we go. Then we are going to take the input for the steam, and we got the output for the steam up here. We're just going to bring that bad boy down and across, and there we go. Now, one thing that we are going to do is we need to make sure that we have both the extra sodium coming in. And right now I could probably cut the sodium production down here. Once you have enough, and it really depends on your setup, and I'll go over why later, but once you have enough of this, you can cut this. I'm not going to, because eventually this will be full of sodium and we can just it'll turn off on its own. It'll stop running. So that's fine. It doesn't hurt to have this here in case something goes wrong. The other thing that you need to do that for is the water. The other portion of this that's going to be affected by those internal buffer things is going to be the water, and that's the stream right here. So not only will we want this to already be full at the start, but we would actually want to make sure that there's excess in this pipe system right here to support it. And so what we are going to do is basically whip out some of these pumps right here, and we're going to whip out a quantum entangloporter and some buckets of water. And we're going to set up a system right here really quickly. And we could leave it here if we wanted to. We don't have to, though, once the system gets going. But right now, for the time being, we are going to quickly set this up and put our water down right here and get our two pumps going. And put these right like that. And then we're going to have to spin them around so that we can actually plug these in. And then let's get out our universal cable, quantum entangloporter, put that bad boy down right here, and give us some power. And we need to obviously set it to be outputting and auto eject. And there we go. So we should be getting water going in here, and this is going to take forever to fill up. Now, do I have any upgrades in here, or did I not actually remember to make any upgrades for these? Do I even have all the stuff needed to do these right now? I don't care about energy upgrades, but I would like some speed upgrades. So we need some osmium dust. Okay, so let's grab out this. You know what? No, I'm going to do this off camera. I'm not going to make you guys watch this. So I'll hop off camera. We'll get these upgraded. We will get the water completely full in this, and then we will get a backlog of water here. So if you're doing this in your world, start getting the internal tank of this filled up, because that's going to take a while, and get a buffer set up right here. And then we will be back when it's good to go, and we can flick this bad boy on and see it run. Okay guys, so we are back and everything is good to go with some minor adjustments. So quickly we can go over those, and then I will turn this thing on, we can watch it run and go over the last important thing, which is the nuances that make all these changes required. So you can see this is completely full right here. We have a nice 3 million millibuckets inside the thermoelectric boiler, which you think would be sufficient. But it's actually not, and we just managed to make this work with all these mechanical pipes right here. And you can see that I actually extended this to make it pretty much the maximum length possible, specifically so that we have the internal storage of each of these mechanical pipes. So you can see in here, we have 8.2 million millibuckets of water just in this piping system. And so all that water is essentially going to be our buffer. Now you could make a tank for this if you wanted to hold it, but for me, storing it in the pipe sufficient. But if this wasn't sufficient, I'd either need a tank or to just start putting down random mechanical pipes around this to store additional water. Or we could have a bigger tank on this if we wanted to, which is why I stated it's important to make sure you have an adequate tank size on here. And apparently I should have made it even bigger. But the reason we need this, and the reason we needed the excess sodium over here, is for when we turn this on. And so when I activate it, it is currently set at a rate of 54, which is its maximum. And I would not advise you guys to ever turn these on like this. I'd work your way up, titrate it up, start at 1, then go to 5, 10, and then slow down as you notice things start to kind of turn in the direction you don't want them to. But we can activate this right now, and it's going to be loud, so I'll try and reduce the sound in the editing of the video. But you can see here, immediately this coolant tank shoots down. It goes down super quickly. And so the reason that this happens is because the coolant is getting used up by this over here. And you can see it's got a ton of the sodium in here, and the number's not really changing. It's actually fluctuating at the exact same number, but this amount is always going to be in here, even though theoretically, based on the boil rate, we can actually support this, and the math supports it. It might sound stupid, but the reason that this is not changing is because everything that comes in here is being immediately converted to steam. And that's why right now the water is not changing and the superheated sodium isn't. But for some reason, it requires these to be partially full. So in this case, you'd think the water would be completely full, and you would think that the heated coolant would be completely empty. But for some reason, even though that this is being processed, you still have an amount in here that's not moving, meaning everything now coming in is being converted, but at the beginning, it didn't do that. I don't know why that is. I believe it just occurs with every one of these multi-blocks in Mekanism. As we can see, it currently occurs with the reactor over here, where the coolant is reduced. It occurs with this one right here. And then over here at the turbine, you can see it occurs, and this occurred earlier, where the steam is sitting at a constant amount, producing our power and then recondensing into water. But it actually wasn't as noticeable because we had a slower burn rate upstairs when we were working with the water cooled one, and B, there was only 2 multi-blocks. In this one, it's multiplied in its effect because there's 3 of them. So you actually are now spreading that stuff out where you need to worry about both the sodium count and the water. So because these do hold things, even though theoretically, based on the math, everything should immediately be converted from superheated sodium into steam, and then the cooled sodium should go right back in. That does not happen because you have a bunch of it stored inside the boiler. And then over here, because you should theoretically, because we have the math done out to make sure it's sufficient, all of that steam should immediately be put in here and used up and turned into water and condensed and put back in here. But because that doesn't happen, because there's a ton of steam that just sits in here, you need to make sure that you have sufficient water to account for all this extra steam, because the steam that's sitting in here, you now have almost 10,000 millibuckets or 10 million millibuckets of steam that's not turned into water. And that's where this buffer comes in. And it's the same over here. All this superheated sodium, you need to make sure that you have some going back in here. Now, the one last thing I'm going to touch on as to why that's critical is because right here, this sodium in this fission reactor cannot dip below your current heating rate. Because the way it treats it is, even if you have a sufficient amount being pumped in, you need to have a sufficient amount in here to match your heating rate. Otherwise, it reduces the heating rate. So even if mathematically you have a consistent stream coming back in, if your buffer is not enough to allow you to have, so if I had 9 million in here, but I was processing all of it and the number wasn't moving, if I increased this and the heating rate went up, even though theoretically everything down the line can process it, it's going to start increasing in temp because the heating rate's going to decrease. So you need to make sure in here that even once you have all of this superheated sodium over here, that you have over the maximum heating rate you're going to need of sodium still inside this reactor. And the same goes for water over here. So the boil rate right now is almost 1.1 million. If this was below 1.1 million millibuckets because all of that steam was stuck over there, then this thing is not going to reach its max boil rate and everything falls apart. So it's extremely critical that you keep an eye on this and finely tune these machines to make sure that they work together, assuming you are attempting to make a closed loop system. And it's definitely not easy. Now we could disconnect the electrolytic separator now, and this would be fully closed loop. You can tell because you can see that the sodium's actually going up in here over time. That's all the production from this. But this is actually functioning. It's unfortunate that this is not completely full of water because it looks cooler, but you could pump extra water in if you really wanted to. But now we have a fully functioning fission reactor, and we're actually not going to be making enough fissile fuel currently for this super high burn rate. So we're going to turn it off, and I apologize for your ears. I will really lower that when I'm editing the video, but I cannot stress enough how important it is to slowly up your burn rate and work through these problems as you set this up, because it's not just the math. There are other things that you cannot calculate out ahead of time based around how the calculations are done by the actual mod and how these internal buffers work. And we can see the same thing happens if we go upstairs, and we'll do this right before we end the episode, but if we go upstairs and turn on our old fission reactor right here, which is at a lower burn rate, look at this. We got 17.5 million. We activate this, it's perfectly steady state, but look at it. It dropped, the water decreased, and eventually it will reach equilibrium right here. So we lost almost 1 million millibuckets, even though this is totally sufficient. And over here, we've got the 3 million millibuckets of steam sitting here. And now it's instantly processing everything. The tank is not filling up or going down, neither is this, but it happens with this too. So honestly, it's a little bit confusing. It makes it way harder than it should be to set these up, but it means you got to think through it a little bit. And I know it's a little bit confusing, but if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments. And I think that's going to be it for today, guys. I apologize for all the mathematics and rambling, but it is required to go over this, and make sure you guys don't blow up your base. So good luck with it all, and happy holidays to everyone. This video is going to be going up the day after Christmas because I wasn't able to get one ready before Christmas due to a really bad storm. But hopefully you guys had an awesome holiday, stayed healthy, stayed safe, got to enjoy some time with family, all that good stuff. And I will talk to you guys later.
Faces rolling past me, all my memories rolling vastly.